Thunder crackled across the Montana sky as Violet Krane watched the last shovel of dirt fall onto her husband's grave. A man she barely knew but whose name she had carried for 6 months before the consumption took him. The year was 1876, and at 22 she found herself a widow with nothing but debts and a small, dilapidated homestead on the outskirts of Promise Creek. The mourners, what few there were, departed quickly as rain began to fall, leaving Violet alone with the fresh mound of earth. Her legs trembled beneath her black dress, the weight of her new reality crushing down upon her shoulders until she could no longer stand. She fell to her knees in the dust, her gloved hands sinking into the mud as sobs racked her body. "Mrs. Krane," a deep voice called from behind her. Violet didn't look up, couldn't find the strength to acknowledge whoever had stayed behind. The rain fell harder now, soaking through her mourning clothes. Strong hands gripped her shoulders, and she found herself being lifted from the ground. Through tear-blurred eyes, she looked up to see a weathered face beneath a wide-brimmed hat, raindrops clinging to a neatly trimmed mustache. "You're safe now," the cowboy said, his voice gentle as he helped her to her feet. "Storm's coming in fast. Let me take you home." She didn't know him, not really. She'd seen him around town, heard whispers of his name, Owen Quinn, but they'd never spoken. He was one of the hands from the Rocking R ranch that bordered her late husband's failing property. "I can manage," she whispered, though her legs still threatened to buckle beneath her. "No doubt you can, madam," he replied, "but there's no reason you should have to, not today." That was how it began, with an act of kindness amidst grief and rain in the Montana Territory, where kindness was as rare as water in the summer months. Owen helped Violet onto his horse, mounting behind her and keeping a respectful distance as he guided them back to her homestead. The small cabin came into view, smoke still rising from the chimney where her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had kept the fire going before leaving for her own home. "Your husband was a decent man," Owen said as they approached, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "I didn't know him well, but he always tipped his hat to me in town." Violet nodded stiffly. Thomas Krane had indeed been decent, just not decent enough to tell her about the mountain of debt he'd accumulated before proposing marriage and bringing her out west from Pennsylvania. "Thank you for the escort, Mr. Quinn," she said as he helped her dismount. "I won't keep you any longer." Owen Quinn studied her face for a moment, his blue eyes sharp beneath his hat brim. "Do you have family coming to stay with you, Mrs. Krane?" She shook her head. "My parents are dead." "I have a sister in Boston, but they hadn't spoken in years, not since Violet had chosen to marry Thomas against her sister's advice. "Neighbors, then? Someone to help you sort things out?" Again, she shook her head. "The Pattersons have been kind, but they have their own troubles." Owen glanced at the weathered cabin, the broken fence, the empty corral. "I'll come by tomorrow, see if there's anything needs fixing before winter sets in proper." "I can't pay you," Violet said quickly, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "Didn't ask for payment," he replied, touching the brim of his hat before mounting his horse again. "Just being neighborly." True to his word, Owen arrived the next morning. Violet watched from the window as he rode up, his tall frame straight in the saddle, leading a second horse loaded with tools and supplies. She'd spent the night going through Thomas's papers, confirming what she'd suspected: the bank would claim the property soon enough. She had perhaps a month at most. When she opened the door, Owen stood with his hat in his hands. "Morning, Mrs. Krane. Thought I'd fix that porch step first. It's about to give way." "Mr. Quinn, I appreciate your kindness, but you should know," she swallowed hard. "This place will be the bank soon enough." Something flickered in his eyes, not pity, which she'd come to expect, but something closer to determination. "All the more reason to fix it up. Might fetch a better price if you decide to sell before they claim it." For the next week, Owen came every morning after his duties at the Rocking R were complete. He fixed the porch, mended the fence, patched the roof, and chopped enough firewood to last through the winter. Violet found herself watching him work, admiring the efficiency of his movements, the quiet concentration on his face. On the seventh day, as Violet brought him a cup of coffee, she finally asked the question that had been troubling her. "Why are you doing all this, Mr. Quinn?" "You barely knew my husband." Owen took the cup, his fingers briefly touching hers. "I know what it's like to be alone in this country, Mrs. Krane. When I first came west, a family took me in, helped me find my footing. I'm just paying that forward." "I'll be moving on soon," she admitted. "There's nothing for me here." "Where will you go?" Violet turned her gaze to the distant mountains. "East, perhaps, back to civilization. I could teach school again." Owen nodded, though something in his expression suggested he had more to say. Instead, he returned to his work, hammering with more force than necessary. That evening, as Violet prepared a simple stew payment for Owen's labor, though he'd never asked for it, there was a commotion outside. She opened the door to find 3 men on horseback, none of whom she recognized. "Mrs. Krane," the lead man called, his voice slurred with liquor. "We're here to discuss your husband's debt." Fear slithered down her spine. These weren't bank representatives, they were too rough, too menacing. "My husband's affairs are being settled through the proper channels," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. The man laughed, dismounting with an unsteady lurch. "Your husband borrowed from my boss, not the bank. Mr. Blackmore don't care much for proper channels." As the man approached the porch, Violet retreated inside, slamming the door and sliding the bolt into place. Her hands shook as she searched for Thomas's rifle, finding it beneath their bed. She'd fired it only once, under Thomas's instruction, and the recoil had left her shoulder bruised for days. The men pounded on the door, their threats growing more specific, more terrifying. Violet stood in the center of the cabin, rifle in hand, wondering if she could actually pull the trigger if they broke through. The sound of approaching hoofbeats momentarily silenced the men. Through the window, Violet saw Owen galloping toward the cabin, his face set in hard lines. He dismounted in one fluid motion, hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Evening, gentlemen," his voice carried through the thin walls. "Seems you're disturbing the lady's peace." "This ain't your business, Quinn," one of the men spat. "This is between us and Crane's widow." "Mrs. Krane is under my protection," Owen replied, his tone deceptively casual. "Whatever business you think you have with her, you can discuss it with me." The standoff lasted several tense moments before the lead man backed down. "Tell her this ain't over. Blackmore wants his money." "I'll be sure to pass that along," Owen said, not moving until the 3 men had mounted and ridden away. Violet unbolted the door with trembling hands. "They'll come back," she whispered. "Not tonight, they won't," Owen assured her, stepping inside and gently taking the rifle from her white-knuckled grip. "How much did Thomas borrow from Blackmore?" "I didn't know he'd borrowed from anyone besides the bank," Violet admitted, sinking into a chair. "Those men said something about $200. Owen's jaw tightened. "Blackmore's a loan shark, preys on desperate men. That $200 has probably doubled with his interest." "I don't have even $20 to my name," Violet said, the hopelessness of her situation crashing down upon her. Owen was quiet for a long moment. "Stay here tonight, I'll be outside." "You can't sleep outside, it's freezing." "I've slept in worse conditions," he said with a small smile. "Besides, I won't sleep much, just keep watch." Despite her protests, Owen refused to leave. Violet eventually relented, giving him extra blankets before retiring to her bed, the rifle propped against the wall nearby. Sleep evaded her as she listened to Owen's occasional movements on the porch, the soft creak of boards as he paced, keeping vigil through the night. Morning came with no further disturbances. Violet emerged from the cabin to find Owen building a fire, coffee already brewing. "You need to leave Promise Creek," he said without preamble, handing her a steaming cup. "Blackmore won't let this go." "I have nowhere to go," she admitted, "and no means to get there if I did." Owen stared into the fire. "The cattle drive to Cheyenne leaves in 2 days. I'll be going with it. From there, you could catch a train east." "Mr. Quinn, I appreciate your concern, but I can't afford—" "I have savings," he interrupted. "Enough to get you to Cheyenne and buy a ticket to wherever you want to go." Violet stared at him, stunned by the offer. "Why would you do that for me?" Owen met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw vulnerability in his eyes. "Because I can't bear the thought of those men coming back when I'm not here to stop them." 2 days later, Violet found herself riding alongside the rocking cattle drive, her few possessions packed in saddlebags. Owen had arranged everything a gentle mare for her to ride, permission from his foreman for her to accompany them, and a story about her traveling to meet family in Cheyenne. The drive was grueling, days spent in the saddle under the relentless sun, nights huddled around campfires as the cowboys took turns watching the herd. Violet kept to herself, aware of the curious glances from the other hands, though none questioned her presence openly. Owen maintained a respectful distance during the day, focused on his work, but each night he would bring her a plate of whatever Cookie had prepared, sit beside her, and tell her stories of his travels through the West. She learned that he'd come from Boston originally, the son of a shipbuilder who died at sea, leaving Owen to make his own way at 16. He'd worked on riverboats in mines as a cavalry scout before finding his place with cattle. "What about you?" he asked on the fourth night as they sat slightly apart from the others. "What brought you all the way from Pennsylvania to marry a man you barely knew?" Violet stared into the flames. "Dreams of adventure, perhaps, or just desperation to escape." "Escape what?" "Spinsterhood," she admitted with a self-deprecating smile. "I was 21, teaching in a small school, living with a disapproving sister after our parents died. Thomas's letters painted such a picture of opportunity in Montana, a chance to build something of my own." "I'm sorry it didn't turn out that way," Owen said softly. She shrugged. "I've learned a valuable lesson about dreams and reality." "Not all dreams are meant to disappoint," he replied, his voice low. "Some just take a different path than we expected." The way he looked at her then, firelight dancing in his eyes, made her heart beat faster. She turned away, uncomfortable with the feelings stirring within her, inappropriate feelings for a woman still in mourning, still wearing her dead husband's ring. The next day, disaster struck. A sudden thunderstorm spooked the herd, causing a stampede that sent cowboys scrambling to control the terrified cattle. Violet's mare reared, throwing her to the ground as thousands of pounds of beef thundered past. She crawled desperately toward a fallen log, seeking shelter from the deadly hooves. Through the dust and chaos, she saw Owen racing toward her, maneuvering his horse through the stampeding cattle with incredible skill. He reached down as he galloped past, strong arm hooking around her waist, lifting her onto his horse in one fluid motion that left her breathless. They rode hard, Owen's body shielding hers as he guided his horse to safety. When they finally stopped, well away from the danger, Violet realized she was trembling, her face pressed against Owen's chest, his heartbeat pounding in her ear. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. She shook her head, unable to speak, unwilling to move from the safety of his arms. They stayed that way longer than propriety allowed, until Owen finally, reluctantly, helped her dismount. That night, after the herd had been gathered and calm restored, Violet found herself unable to sleep. She sat by the dying embers of the fire, replaying the moment Owen had saved her, the feeling of his arms around her, the sense of absolute safety she'd felt despite the danger. "You should be resting," Owen's voice came from behind her. She turned to see him approaching, his features soft in the faint glow of the coals. "I keep seeing those cattle, hearing them." He nodded, sitting beside her. "First stampede leaves an impression." "You saved my life today," she said quietly. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," she contradicted him. "Not anyone, just you." The look that passed between them was charged with unspoken feelings. Owen reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek, warm and calloused. "Violet," he whispered, the first time he'd used her given name. She closed her eyes at the sound of it on his lips. When she opened them again, he was closer, his intention clear in his gaze. He paused, waiting for her permission, which she gave with the slightest nod. His kiss was gentle, hesitant, a question rather than a demand. Violet found herself answering, her hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling his heart racing beneath her palm. When they parted, she felt tears on her cheeks, tears of confusion, of guilt, of longing. "I'm sorry," Owen said immediately, mistaking her tears for regret. "I shouldn't have known," she interrupted. "It's not that, it's just everything. Thomas, the homestead, Blackmore's men, this journey, and now you, it's too much to make sense of." Owen took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her skin. "We reach Cheyenne in 3 days. You don't have to decide anything now." But 3 days seemed both an eternity and no time at all as Violet wrestled with her feelings. During the day, she rode alongside the herd, watching Owen work, admiring his skill with horses and cattle, the easy way he commanded respect from the other hands. At night, they would talk by the fire, careful to maintain a proper distance after that one impulsive kiss, though the awareness between them grew with each passing hour. On the eve of their arrival in Cheyenne, Owen found her at the edge of camp, staring at the stars. "I've purchased your ticket to Boston," he said, holding out an envelope. "Train leaves day after tomorrow." Violet took the envelope, her fingers brushing his. "Thank you. I'll repay you someday." "No need," he replied, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "Though I was wondering if you might consider an alternative." Her heart skipped a beat. "What alternative?" "Stay," he said simply. "Not in Cheyenne, but with me." "With you," she repeated, hardly daring to understand his meaning. Owen took a deep breath. "I've saved enough to buy a small spread near the Powder River. Good land with water rights. I was heading there after getting paid for this drive." He paused, gathering courage. "It would be a hard life at first, building something from nothing, but it would be ours." "Owen," she whispered, her voice catching, "we barely know each other." "I know enough," he replied. "I know you're brave and resilient. I know you didn't cry when you were thrown from your horse. I know you help Cookie with dishes without being asked. I know you read Shakespeare by firelight." He stepped closer. "And I know I've never felt this way about anyone before. I'm still a married woman in the eyes of the law," she reminded him, though Thomas had been in the ground less than 3 weeks. "I'm not asking to rush anything," Owen assured her. "Stay in Cheyenne while I establish the homestead. Give yourself time to properly mourn. Give us time to exchange letters to know each other better." His hand found hers in the darkness. "All I'm asking is for a chance, Violet, a chance to build something real, something honest between us." Tears filled her eyes again, but this time they were tears of possibility, of hope cautiously rekindled. "People will talk." A smile touched his lips. "Let them. Out here, people are judged more by what they build than who they were before." She looked down at the train ticket in her hand, then back up at the man before her, this cowboy who had lifted her from the dust and offered her safety in more ways than one. "Write to me," she said finally. "Write to me from your new land, tell me about the house you'll build, the cattle you'll raise, and in 6 months if you still want me there." The joy that spread across Owen's face was answer enough. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. 6 months, he agreed. "Though I already know my feelings won't change." They reached Cheyenne the next day, the cattle delivered to the stockyards, the cowboys celebrating their payment with whiskey and card games. Owen secured Violet a room at a respectable boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Thornton, who agreed to take Violet on as help in exchange for reduced rent. The morning of Owen's departure came too quickly. He stood outside the boarding house, his horse packed for the journey north, his eyes never leaving Violet's face. "I'll write as soon as I'm established," he promised. "And I'll come for you before winter if you'll have me." "I'll be waiting for your letters," she replied, fighting the urge to beg him to stay, knowing he needed to secure their future first. His kiss goodbye was brief but filled with promise, witnessed only by the rising sun and Mrs. Thornton's curious glance from the window. Violet watched him ride away, this man she'd known for less than a month, who had somehow become the center of her thoughts, her hopes. It was madness, perhaps falling for a cowboy while still wearing widow's black, but in the harsh reality of the West, conventional rules seemed less important than the truth of one's heart. Owen's first letter arrived 3 weeks later, describing the land he'd purchased 300 acres with a creek running through it, mountains visible in the distance, wild horses on the neighboring range. He wrote of the temporary shelter he'd built, the plans for a proper house with a stone fireplace and windows facing east to catch the morning light. Violet replied, telling him of her life in Cheyenne, the work at the boarding house, the small garden she'd started in the back. She confessed her growing feelings for him, emotions that should have been inappropriate for a recent widow but felt more genuine than anything in her brief marriage to Thomas. Their correspondence continued through summer and into fall. Owen wrote of the cabin he was building, room by room, with help from neighboring ranchers. Violet described the skills she was learning preserving food, making soap, treating minor injuries, all preparation for the life that waited if she chose it. In her fourth letter, Violet included news that reached her from Promise Creek. Blackmore had been arrested for the murder of a miner who couldn't pay his debts. His men had scattered, and the loans he'd forced on desperate people were being forgiven by the territorial judge. The threat that had driven her from her homestead was gone, though she felt no desire to return to that place of false dreams. As promised, Owen rode into Cheyenne before the first snow, 6 months to the day since they'd parted. Violet saw him from the boarding house window, taller than she remembered, his face more weathered from months of outdoor work, his eyes scanning the street until they found her. She ran to meet him, propriety forgotten, as he swung down from his horse and lifted her into an embrace that felt like coming home. Mrs. Thornton watched from the porch, smiling despite her usual strictness about proper behavior. "I've come to ask properly," Owen said when he finally set Violet down. "No rush, no pressure. Just a question that's been on my heart since the moment I first saw you." He knelt in the dusty street, uncaring of the curious onlookers gathering on the boardwalk. From his pocket, he produced a simple gold band. "Violet Krane, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, not because you need saving, but because I believe we could build something beautiful together?" Through tears of joy, Violet nodded. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Owen Quinn, I will marry you." They were wed 2 days later in Cheyenne's small church, Violet in a blue dress rather than black, Owen in the only suit he owned. Mrs. Thornton stood as witness, along with the preacher's wife and several boarders who had become Violet's friends. The journey to their new home took a week, through increasingly rugged country that tested even Owen's trail skills. When they finally crested the last hill, Violet gasped at the sight before her, a sturdy cabin nestled against a stand of pines, smoke curling from the stone chimney, a small corral containing half a dozen horses, and beyond, rolling grassland stretching to distant mountains. "It's not much yet," Owen said uncertainly, "but by spring I'll have the barn finished, and with the cattle I've purchased, we'll start building a proper herd." Violet turned to him, her heart so full she could hardly speak. "It's perfect," she managed. "It's everything I never knew to dream of." He lifted her from her horse and carried her across the threshold of their new home, setting her down in a main room dominated by a fireplace built of river stones. A rough-hewn table stood in one corner, 2 chairs waiting beside it. Through an open doorway, she glimpsed a bedroom with a bed frame Owen had clearly crafted himself. "Welcome home, Mrs. Quinn," he said, his voice thick with emotion. That winter tested their resolve and their growing love. Blizzards isolated them for weeks at a time, temperatures dropped to bone-chilling lows, and supplies dwindled faster than anticipated. But in the confines of their cabin, Violet and Owen discovered the depth of their compatibility, reading aloud by firelight, teaching each other skills, sharing stories of their lives before they met, and making plans for the ranch's future. By spring, Violet knew she was carrying their child. When she told Owen, his joy was boundless. He spent the following months building a cradle, expanding the cabin to include a nursery, and fretting over Violet's every movement despite her assurances that pregnancy didn't make her fragile. Their daughter, Elizabeth, was born on a clear autumn day, with only Owen and a neighboring rancher's wife to help with the delivery. As Violet held their child for the first time, Owen beside her with wonder in his eyes, she marveled at the journey that had brought her here from a grief-stricken widow on her knees in the dust to a beloved wife and mother on land she could truly call her own. 5 years passed, the ranch growing prosperous under their joint efforts. Elizabeth was joined by a brother, James, and the Quinn brand became known for quality cattle throughout the territory. They hired hands, built a bunkhouse, expanded their operations with each successful season. On their 5th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their now expanded home watching their children play in the yard, Owen took Violet's hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Choosing this life instead of returning east?" Violet looked out at the land. They'd transformed together, the garden bursting with vegetables, the orchard beginning to bear fruit, the healthy cattle grazing on distant hillsides. She thought of the community they'd helped build, the neighboring families who gathered for holidays and barn raisings, the school she taught in 3 days a week. "Not for a single moment," she answered truthfully. "That day you found me at Thomas's grave when you lifted me from the dust and promised safety. I thought you were just being kind to a grieving widow." Owen smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "I was, but I also knew somehow that my life had just changed forever." "Mine too," she whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I just didn't know it yet." As the sun set over their land, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, Violet thought about the peculiar alchemy of life, how loss could transform into love, how endings could become beginnings, and how a moment of kindness from a stranger could change the course of 2 lives forever.